I typically have the Octatrack memory set to 24-bit. In particular, I find that using 24-bit adds depth to the reverbs. However, for certain tracks, I have preferred the sound of 16-bit. You can also see here that I have dynamic recorders on, and I have no reserved recordings. This is mainly out of convenience. But if you start to experience strange issues with your recorder buffers, I suggest to reserve some recording. So track 1 here is where everything all started. As you can see in these different patterns, there's relatively few triggers that are being activated. Most of these are fill condition triggers. I used both fill conditions and non-fill conditions to create more variations in these patterns. The fill trigs on this track are primarily these hi-hat types of hits. The not fill conditions were primarily used to remove a snare here and there when using the fill. On the first two patterns, this sound is meant to provide a regular rhythmic backdrop. To latch fill mode until the next pattern repeat, hold the down arrow and press the scale setup button. To permanently latch the fill mode, hold the up and down arrow and press the scale setup button. This entire track was produced using the same basic techniques you can find in my Octatrack synthesis filter ping percussion video. When holding down the up arrow, pressing and holding the scale setup button is a manual latch for fill mode, and it's the way to turn off the permanent latch. I generated this noise sample using the Octatrack, and I saved it and assigned it to the record buffer. You can see that the playhead cursor is jumping around a bit randomly. The random modulation I have on the start position of this noise sample is actually the only random element in this entire composition. I did this to more closely approximate using actual white noise in this scenario, as well as to introduce a bit of additional subtle variation. On this particular sound, I messed with the amplitude envelope setup page. Normally I'm happy with default settings here, but I wanted to change the re-triggering behavior and the attack shape. The way I set this track up, these settings come into play the most when using fill mode and when activating some of the scenes, particularly the scenes with longer attack times. Now back to analog retriggering. Even without longer attack times, it's a minor but notable variation. For LFO modulations on this track, we have the randomized start position discussed earlier, as well as filter width modulation, but this filter width modulation is disabled by default and only comes into play when activating scenes. Here are the default settings for the filter on this track, and this filter has been significantly altered from the standard configuration in the setup page. To shape the sound after the filter, I'm using a compressor with a fairly high RMS value. Activating the encoder button will allow you to see the value without changing it in these situations. Now I want to dig into the scenes a bit, but first we need to address what's happening with the master track. On the second effects slot of the master track, I have a dark reverb, and the first effects slot is a compressor with the RMS value at 0. The compressor is in a very aggressive parallel compression setup. Taking a look at the dark reverb setup page, you can see that I have pre-delay activated, as well as a tiny bit of balance shift. And of course, this reverb is in send configuration. The reason I jumped to the master track before demonstrating the scenes is because the scenes contain P-locks for the master track reverb. As mentioned earlier, these scene changes that lengthen the attack time are much more dramatically affected by the amplitude envelope setup page settings. Scene 6 is a very important scene. Not much variation on the keyboard scenes for this track. Let's take a look at these filter scene locks. Some of them will even reverse the direction of the envelope sweep. Not much happening on these keyboard scenes. On this track, I have it set to 57% swing. This swing value is constant across the three patterns. Overall, this noisy percussion track is pretty basic. Its primary purpose is to keep time and subdivide time. Each of the patterns is set to use a two-step pattern chain behavior. For this type of free-flowing phrasing, I like to have control over the master pattern length directly. So now we're going to jump all the way over to track 6 and track 7 for the bass drum sound. Since this track was derived from an experiment in synthesis, a couple false starts on the bass drum which happened on tracks 2 through 4 were later repurposed for other sounds. And track 5 had already been set up as a resampling channel. Note the sample has been pitched down, and we have a very blocky amplitude envelope. You can see that every LFO is being utilized for this track. 2 of the LFOs have been set up as triggered envelopes using the exponential shape. One modulates the sample pitch, and the other modulates the high-pass filter. And a simple triangle LFO is used to subtly modulate the low-pass filter frequency. In the filter setup, I've raised the distortion value and changed the low-pass slope. The low-pass slope is particularly important for making the bass drum sound a bit deeper. I'm thickening and shaping the signal coming off of this filter with a compressor. It has pretty extreme settings. By using scene locks on these triggered LFOs, this scene here has a different timbre for the bass drum. And some of these scenes contain locks for the filter values. In order to further shape this bass drum sound, I'm using a neighbor track. The first effect on the neighbor track is the 2-band equalizer. You can see I have the second band set to be a high shelf. This helps me bring back some of the high frequencies I lost by using the steep low-pass filter slope. On these breakdown scenes, I'm using the equalizer somewhat as a filter. And in the second effect slot on this neighbor track, after the equalizer, I have another compressor. And you can see it's basically right in between an RMS and a peak sensing compressor. Very different settings compared to the first compressor, as it serves a very different purpose. The bass drum track is the other main track besides the noisy percussion track that also gets fill conditions. And I'm using a compressor gain P-lock on the neighbor track here, not only to create accents, but also ghost notes and little clicks. I've got a bit of swing on the bass drum and its neighbor track here at 53%. The 3 different bass drum patterns are all derived from this original 16-step pattern, and the second and third patterns use a cross-rhythmic approach. The relationship between the source track and the neighbor track for the bass drum is very important. This particular neighbor track pattern contains slide trigs. These slide trigs are primarily responsible for modulating the EQ. It produces some soft clicking and a subtle filter sweep sensation. This pattern doesn't have any neighbor track trigs. Time to unmute the noisy percussion track to see how it works in tandem with the bass drum. All of the other sounds in this composition were produced by resampling these 2 tracks, and in some instances, resampling the resample. I set up scene 6 as an important wash scene that I structured the entire arrangement around. We'll take a look at some of the conditions on the bass drum triggers. As I usually do, I did not use any percentage probability triggers, only fill triggers and the condition triggers. There are a pretty substantial number of fill triggers on these tracks. Note that I used some not fill conditions. It's a little tricky to see it, but it's the fill with a line over the top. Those triggers are silenced while in fill mode. Okay, this is the point where it's going to start getting pretty confusing, although it may not seem that confusing right away. This flex machine setup is notable because I have time stretch on. Just default settings in the amp setup. And for the LFO modulations, we have amplitude envelope release, playback retrigger, and playback start position. This track mainly plays back from its recorder buffer, and for the effects, I have a filter on slot 1 and a flanger on slot 2. This filter is set up with steeper slopes and a little bit of distortion. The flanger on this track is how I'm producing the majority of the pitched tones that occur in this composition. A flanger is just a type of comb filter, so I kind of lied when I said I didn't use any comb filters. Let's take a look at this neighbor track now. It has a cross-rhythmic modulation pattern using the triggers. I'm primarily sliding the parameter locks attached to the chorus on this track. I can't quite remember, so I'm going to check for some conditional trigs. Putting conditions on these modulation triggers can be pretty interesting. Let's take a look at those slide and swing trigs. One very important slide trig right here, and you can see I have slightly different swing values on the two tracks. Which reminds me to check the swing on the bass drum as well. Looks like I matched these two up, didn't want them to get too sloppy. But over here I wanted some extra slop. So here's a quick and dirty way to avoid playback stopping when you're doing live resampling. Just sample lock that trigger that's not playing to something else. This first trigger is just the noise sample. Most of the rest will be default though, but take a close look at this trigger. I set up various feedback relationships between the different live resampling channels that I used in this track. Record buffer 2 actually sources its audio from track 4. Let's listen to another pattern. These types of pleasant sounds bring to my mind enjoyable trips to the dentist. This third pattern has a pretty frenetic modulation pattern on the neighbor track. Let's look at that record buffer. This record buffer sources from the cue. You can see it's clipping sometimes, but this track isn't necessarily supposed to be a pristine sound generator. You can see I did turn down the Q bus a bit in the mixer page though. I wanted to have some level of dynamics, not just have a completely clipped recording. As usual, I'm using a relatively short recording length. One thing that's easy to overlook when using the Q is that you can set independent Q levels for each channel going into the Q bus. Hold down the Q button in order to see the Q level of a track instead of the regular main level. However, you can see I left the Q sends at their default value for this project. Note that it is not necessary to be in studio mode to access independent Q send levels, despite what the wording in the relevant manual section implies. Studio mode actually reduces functionality for a minor gain in the ability to see Q levels and track main levels simultaneously. The way these scenes will directly affect this particular sound generating track are fairly mild. It's due to the interaction of scene changes with the live resampling and all the feedback between the resampling channels that brings a lot of variation into this particular sound generating track. For scenes 1 through 5, I used those to do the interludes. These scenes allow me to repitch the flanger feedback. A more sparse pattern like this one is a little trickier to play with the scene changes. The second and third patterns are busier, so they have a more immediate response to the scene transposition changes. On track 2, that's the bass sound. As I previously mentioned, this track records from track 4. Since this track is cued, this sets up a potential feedback relationship between these different recording buffers. I didn't set up this relationship expecting to achieve a certain result. I was simply curious what would happen. You can see that the first trigger in this pattern is sample locked to a resample. Other than the noise sample, this was the only pre-recorded resample used for the performance. This bass track is really a pretty simple idea. Mainly it's just about taking small chunks of the resample and then re-triggering it, pitching it down, and filtering it. A few key triggers here and there with important parameter locks, and a few conditional triggers. The bass trigger pattern might be the most minimal of all the sounds. One of the LFOs on this track modulates the playback retrigger, and another LFO modulates the filter width. Like most of the tracks in this project, this is a filter followed by a compressor. Bit of filter distortion and a steeper low-pass slope. I believe this is the only compressor on this project that has a full RMS value. Very heavy compression and quite a considerable amount of gain being added. Some of the important scene locks for this track have to do with the LFOs, particularly their relationship to the filter values and the playback retrigger. There are many sounds in this track breakdown that don't exist in the final performance of the track because the scene changes will interact with each other. All of the flanger transposition scenes mute the bass track pre-effects using the vowel parameter. Take a quick look at the bass track pattern lengths and scaling. Okay, now on to the primary playback channel for the pre-recorded resample. I set up the record buffer for this track to record from the main outputs. The original intention of this particular track was to have a resampling channel that I would manually activate the resampling for. At some point during the production process, this particular resample got recorded, and I quite liked it, so I decided to save it. I simply assigned the file after I saved it to the recording buffer. This way I still have access to activating manual resampling, but now every time I start the project up, this particular file will be loaded to this recording buffer. You can see this first trigger is sample locked to recording buffer 2, and also note that this track is queued as well. Very incestuous relationships between these different channels. For modulations on this channel, I'm modulating the playback start and both sides of the filter. There are a few important P-locks scattered here and there amongst these triggers, as well as some trigger conditions on some of the patterns. A few excessive retrigger P-locks as well provide an important flavor. This might be the only filter on the whole track I didn't use any distortion. This resampling channel also has the only other reverb, bit of the gate volume threshold activated, as well as a bit of balance shift. I really like how the master track dark reverb interacts with this plate reverb. It gets rather dramatic. I don't recall tuning any of these scene changes to the resample. I believe most of these settings already existed by the time I saved that sample. I'm really enjoying hearing these scene changes on this track in isolation. I don't believe I soloed this track before. A very useful feature on the Octatrack is the ability to assign files to recording buffers. I find this convenient for ensuring a particular default state on these more interactive types of resampling projects. Now I'm going to record what we're hearing right now into track 5's resampling channel. This is the resampling channel that samples the main outputs. And now the previously recorded resample has now been replaced. Not the most interesting new resample, but it's clearly different than the previous sample. Let's see if we can get a sense of how much this new resample is bleeding into the other resampling channels. So I don't really like this resample, and it's very easy for me to revert back to the original file that I have assigned to this buffer with the convenient revert to saved file command. If I have a recording in a recording buffer that I want to save and keep using in that recording buffer, then I'm going to use the save and assign sample to self function. This automatically saves a copy of the file to the compact flash card, enabling easy reversion of the recording buffer to the original sample. Let's try resampling the main output again and see what other possibilities are present. In this particular instance, I basically had it resample itself. I'll have it resample itself again. Pretty fascinating how you get from A to C here. Now to unmute some of the other sounds. Okay, let's try some more sounds into that resampling channel, which, as you'll recall, samples from the main output. Basically just a big mess, so revert to saved file. Really, when I started developing these sounds, I didn't necessarily intend to finish a piece of music with them, but I found them compelling and interesting enough to keep spending time with them, which is the most important thing. Even though in many ways this track was incredibly simple, it's very difficult to take a reductionist approach when examining its contents. I know I left at least a few things out of this breakdown, but I hope that gives an overall idea of how I approached this particular piece.